Welcome to our program. Sheri, if you want to go ahead and start your video, that'd be great. Here you are. Hi.
Hello.
To Deschutes Public Library's online programming. My name is Liz Goodrich, and I'm part of the community relations team at the library. And I would just like to welcome everybody for here tonight for Novel Idea 2022. We are celebrating our 19th year of this community-wide reading project, and we are so honored that readers join us every year to participate in this very important community building activity through books. The idea behind Novel Idea is pretty simple. We pick a great book, and this year we picked two great books. We organize a whole month of programming, engaging our community in really important discussions and learning opportunities. And then we wrap up the project with visits from the author. This year we picked two books. Like I said, we have a book for young readers and a book for adults, both written by Native women authors. And they will be joining us in person this year for the first time in 3 years. We're going to have an in-person Novel Idea program, author presentations the first weekend in May. We will be at Bend High on Friday, May 6th, and at Madras Performing Arts Center on Saturday, May 7th. Tickets are free. You can get them at all of our libraries. You can get them on our website. We like to think that Novel Idea is the largest and most successful community-wide reading program in Oregon. And we are so excited tonight to welcome Sheri Freemont here to talk about a very important topic. Sheri is an Indigenous lawyer, Turtle, Mountain, Chippewa, and Omaha, currently working with Casey Family Programs, a national foundation aiming to reduce the need for foster care. Sheri identifies through her relationships as a mother, daughter, sister, granddaughter, auntie, and partner. She was raised biculturally and uses her experiences and education to focus on how values and systemic racism impact child welfare practice. She was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, and now resides in Denver, Colorado with her husband and children. And tonight's presentation is kind of a free-flowing conversation. So if you have questions for Sheri, please put those in the Q&A. She'll answer them as we move through the program rather than saving them for the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A and we will go ahead and get started. So welcome, Sheri.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for those of you who were joining us online tonight. We're getting better and better at using virtual technology. So this topic is always sensitive and can bring up a lot of emotion. So I always like to give that heads up in advance that it's okay to have feelings as we talk about sensitive issues. It is okay to feel all the things. And by that, I mean, I've talked about this topic hundreds of times, and you might feel sad, you might feel angry, you might feel inspired. It can be the whole range, and I just want to acknowledge that that's okay. But some of the things that we talk about, or I talk about in this, I think they're important to know, and I think we avoid them for a lot of reasons. And so you chose to show up tonight, and I'm grateful for that. But it is okay if anything, if you need to take a break. And I will say, I think that after we talk about this, sometimes the feelings and the responses to this could bubble up over time, and that's okay too. We're human beings, and that's a part of the game, right? So I like to put that out there that this might be difficult, and just know that in advance. I'm going to share my screen a few times today. So I'm a Indigenous lawyer. I live in Colorado from Oregon. And so I've been practicing in this area of law for most of my career. I was a prosecutor. I worked for tribes, and then I did child welfare primarily in state and tribal court. And now I work for a national foundation where we are aiming to reduce foster care nationwide. But my particular passion is particularly around Indian Child Welfare Act issues. So sometimes I'm going to say a couple of words tonight that might seem new to you or discomforting or whatever. So I'm going to say, please be prepared to hear words like Indian, or and I know for my tribal people, sometimes hearing we want to be identified by our tribal affiliation and not the broad term of Indian, but I say Indian because it's the way that it's captured in the law and the way I was raised identifying. I say Indigenous, I say tribal, I say Native. So all those things to me, I use interchangeably, but not everybody does. But I just want to say that. I will also use words that can be difficult to hear, which are words like colonization, colonizing, conquering, and the word genocide. Those words are also difficult, and just know that I will say them and we can talk about how I mean it and what we're talking about, but those words will probably come up. I always like to start with this silly question to get our juices flowing. So I don't know, I can see the names, so I don't know if anybody in there identifies as Indigenous, but for all the attendees, will you do me a favor and list in the chat as a question a famous Native person that's alive today that the rest of the people in this webinar would probably know. So just like, who's a famous Indian that you can name that's alive today that other people might also know? Give you a few seconds to chat it in. Got one answer. Oh, you can put it in the Q&A. Okay, thanks, Anna. Okay, if you can't do it, it is fine, because that's kind of the point. So thanks for knowing Wes Studi, an actor and director. But the point of that is what I like to say is the invisibleness of tribal people. And so in the context of child welfare, somebody wrote Scott Momade, and I have to say I don't know who that is. So I'm sorry. The point being is that when children are removed from tribal people and live with other families, that they often would not have exposure to other tribal people, because what we often see in the media is stereotypes or other depictions. Although we've gotten a lot better. We're seeing much more diversity in films. But when we've tried to think about what would Indian children think of what it means to be Native if they're not around other Native people in alternative care, if that makes sense. So going back to this really quick, I probably should know who that is. So Robin Wall Kimmerer is also an author, right? So people in the literary world would know who that is, but a lot of people wouldn't. And so I'm a big fan of my Indigenous women writers, so I know who that is. So thank you for knowing who that is. All right, next, I'm now going to share my screen to get us started on this presentation. So, humility. Whoops, sorry. So, I do not speak my tribal languages. My grandparents spoke 2 different tribal languages, and my great-grandparents spoke 4 tribal languages, different than one another, different dialects. On your screen, you should be able to see the Ojibwe word, or the Anishinaabe word, for humility. And humility, in at this point of this slide, is to talk about how things that get translated into English, and we know this if you speak other languages, we lose a lot of meaning. Values and intention are wrapped up in language, right? So for humility in Ojibwe, it really, the piece of it really means is nobody can be higher or better than the other. And so we say it's represented by the wolf, because a wolf lives in a pack and they need all of each other. And while there may be a leader, right, it's only in service to others. And the ultimate shame would be to be kicked out of the pack. So you are always wanting to be a part and to be humble. Humility is to never be arrogant and self-important, and never higher than another. So this is sometimes a really difficult concept when we think about it in ways of being in American society, is like we're a competitive society by nature, but one of our values in Ojibwe culture is to not hold any individual higher than another, even when they've made mistakes, even when they've done bad things. We have to respond to them with love, no matter what. In English, what it means to be humble is more to have a modest view of your individual self. And it also means to not be prideful in relation to the Christian context of, in relation to God. So God, you don't know more than God, and that you have a modest view of yourself. So just slightly different, well, maybe vastly different. But the point being here is that when we lose language, we lose cultural meaning and values. And so I just like to talk about that. I ask that when we talk about these issues, we think about having humility, approaching this with like, maybe I don't know what I think I know, maybe I have more to learn. I'm going to go to Q&A before I start. Okay. So I'm going to talk tonight about the American Indian Child Welfare Act, but I am also pretty familiar with the way things operate in Canada. And in Canada, we call ourselves First Nations or Indigenous people. So we will talk about Indigenous ways of child welfare. Okay. Oops, sorry. So one of the things we usually do, and we saw in the beginning, is I don't know where all of you are situated at this moment, like physically, geographically, but everybody is on what once was, and in my opinion, it still is, the Indigenous homelands of the people of the Northwest. In the opening PowerPoint, there was a map, and you can find that on that website called Native Land, and it'll tell you whose lands, the traditional lands in which you are currently in or occupying or living in. Tribal people, this is not debatable, as far as the records in science, have lived in these parts of this continent for at least 30,000 years, and maybe many, much, much more. Not always the exact same people, but Indigenous people. And so we have always been here. And contact is what we refer to as what happens after people from Europe started to show up. So we call that contact, or we refer to it as pre-contact or post-contact. But for thousands and thousands of years, we lived in communities, clans, and societies. And we were highly organized in multiple ways, and very co-independent with trade systems and governmental systems, value systems. And we also were vastly different, right? So we had different, I always like to, if I had studied archaeology or anthropology, the idea that different people, depending on the nature of the land that you live in, behave differently, right? So if you have to be hunters, you might have a different value behavior as opposed to folks who are fishers, right? Hey, so, but in the last 200 years, in particular, the impact of colonization, genocide, and starvation, and forced reservation systems, and a lot of terrible things continues to have significant impact on Indigenous people. I'm going to briefly talk about how this particularly played out with respect to children and how it impacts parenting and social structures like family structures. Thank you for the map. Okay. So, I cannot do a whole history of what's happened to tribal people in an hour. I just want to hit some of the highlights as it's related to child welfare. So, there was an act by Congress in 1819 that was intended to make Native people become fully Christian and civilized. And so there were arrangements made with the churches across the continent to Christianize Native people. So part of it happened through boarding schools, but prior to that, there was other resources. This only was only effective because Indian people had been segregated onto land without food. So they were not, it was conditional in some situations to receive the commodities to eat and stay alive if you went to church and studied these things and learned the Bible and learned English. The whole history of the reservation experience, where tribal people were forbidden to hunt or farm and be entirely dependent on governmental distributions, is devastating on its own. But the forced Christianity may sound strange to people to think that, I mean, because if anybody happens to believe in the Christian church, it's a complicated issue to reflect on that in looking back. On April 1st of this year, I was raised partially Catholic, but it wasn't just the Catholic Church by any means. On April 1st of this year, the Pope issued a formal apology for the Catholic Church's role in respect to Indigenous children in Canada, particularly around the boarding schools. It is 2022 and a long time coming. I don't know if an apology does a whole lot, but it's a start. Sorry, I have to remember I'm on this screen. So the boarding schools, if you guys could chat, who knew of the Indian boarding schools? You can just put yes, no, yes, no. Boarding schools were initiated by someone named Colonel Pratt. He was an Army general, colonel actually, and he really wanted, the congressional record around the boarding schools indicates that it was cheaper to change and make the Indian people submissive and compliant and civilized and turn them into workers than it would to keep fighting them. And so the expression that there was two, kill the Indian and save the man, is one of the quotes. The other one is it's cheaper than bullets, is to take them to schools. And some of the other quotes are really hard to read when they talked about when a child goes in and then when they come out, they will hate everything about their Indianness and reject everything about their Indigenousness and want to just be a white man or white woman. And they also knew in clear documentation that to gain compliance from the tribal people, hold their children hostages would be the most effective. And I don't think any of us as human beings would deny that that's a truth, right? So I find that a hard piece to reckon, because it was not secret. It was very well publicized. It was called the Indian problem as well as white man's burden. And those terms sort of continue today. These are real pictures of real handcuffs of children as young as 5 were taken forcefully away from their children. And in some places, we believe children at birth or younger were taken forcefully as well, because they did have cribs. So it's a very long story. There's actually it's called the Boarding School Investigation Report, which is about to be released next week, commissioned by the federal government. So my great-grandfather and great-grandmother were taken to a school in Pennsylvania called Carlisle. They came from New York and from Omaha, Nebraska, which was thousands of miles away. So a lot of children died at these schools, not primarily from disease, but also from abuse. And sexual abuse was rampant. That's a difficult thing for me to consider. Like, I don't think even I've read so much, it's still difficult to really appreciate systemic child abuse. Systemic sexual child abuse is just sort of not something my brain's really ready to appreciate. But when the children died, they buried them often in mass unmarked graves. And for tribal people, in almost all of our traditions, the death ceremonies are critical in order to reunite in the afterlife or whatever the traditional belief is. So the death ceremonies are significant. So this is a real postcard, if you can see, from Colonel Pratt to a tribal family about a child. And he said, "Your son died quietly without suffering like a man. We have dressed him in his good clothes, and tomorrow we will bury him the way white people do," which was intentional to explain to the tribal people that we will not bury him the way that you guys do ceremonies. He will be put in a box and then put in the dirt. And it was also implication that a lot of tribal people have traditions about what they take with them to the grave, such as belongings, etc. So the idea that he wasn't in his own natural or traditional clothes was also intentional. This is just a couple of pictures you can find about the boarding schools. This is one. There were a lot of children there. And so they were dressed in white people clothes and their hair was cut, and it was absolutely forbidden to speak your tribal language, no matter how young you were. So you would be beaten. And so as I started out this presentation, you heard that I don't speak my tribal languages, and that was an effective process. My grandparents were forced to not speak it, and so over generations, we've continued to lose tribal languages. We believe that there are at least 160 plus that we know have gone extinct, and that's not all the dialects, that's the language groups. And in one of my communities, we have only 8 traditional speakers alive today. So I do my best to practice a word or two because it was forbidden, and it's a human right to be able to speak your language. And so while my language doesn't exist in my natural way, the opportunity to practice saying even words is important to me. This other picture where you can see teepees around the edge, what is for tribal people, they didn't agree to their children being taken away, but they decided that they would go and camp near the children because they wanted their children to see them and say, we did not leave you, we are here. And that's really powerful to me. I'm a person who never was great to be away from my parents. And so the idea that you could at least see them was powerful. I don't know what happened to those particular people, but I think this picture encapsulates that this was never consenting on behalf of tribal people in the beginning. It became to look more consensual over time because of promises made that it would all be okay. They'd all speak white and we'd all be able to own homes and go to, and make money and farm. Checking the chat. Okay. All right. Moving on, sorry. So this is the beginning of tribal welfare, child welfare in the United States and other colonizing countries. The idea that we're going to take your children and make them into better human beings than you're capable of doing. So we're going to take the children away from you and teach them things that are not from their natural family and traditions, and we will make them better people. I include this. This is my great-grandfather's, one of the records that are available online. My great-grandfather went into Carlisle, which is in Pennsylvania, at 11, and he was there until he was 19, maybe 22, depending on the last few years he was there as working. He had ran away several times. He came in with the name Thethigala, and he was named Francis Freemont there, which is how we became Fremont. His father is listed as Ezra, but my great-grandfather was known as Wajipa as our traditional name. He met my great-grandmother there. She was from Seneca Nation, and they ran away twice and then married and then returned to Omaha, where they raised their children. So I note here on this slide, you can see that his degree of Indian blood was already listed as full. And so tribal people didn't know of such a context of knowing full blood or not blood. You were just simply a member of a certain clan or group wherever you either married into or were born into. And so this comes from the idea of how much blood we came from the slavery issues of one drop. So they applied the one drop rule. Like if you had any non-white blood in you, they wanted to know, because the ultimate goal was to bleed it out. And again, really clearly captured in all kinds of history. So taking note there. By 1872, it was pretty well known around that the American philosophy was manifest destiny. This particular famous painting is called American Progress. She's a white woman dressed like an angel, carrying a book of laws, light. She's bringing light and chasing away darkness. And along with the darkness goes the Indians and the buffalo, and in come farming and wagons. And so this art really encaptured the attitude of the nation. And I think it's a complicated story to understand. It was I guess, propaganda and highly cultivated that this was the right way and that God intended it. And that's just complicated because I know that a lot of people still or do accept that. Then came a removal project. And so there were a lot of other areas. I'm going to briefly talk about the adoption era in a minute, but in 1956, Congress enacted a program that moved people from their tribal. So first we were forced onto tribal reservations. And then they were like, if you look at the time around the 50s, it was a little bit of a social awakening right before we go into the civil rights era. And the idea was to move people to the hubs, these urban hubs, to get them work. Mind you, the pilot started about 5 years prior. And my family, which comes from Turtle Mountain, which is way up on the Canadian border up there in North Dakota, was relocated to Portland, Oregon through this program, and Seattle and San Francisco and LA and San Diego. And it also was to work in shipyards. So there was jobs, et cetera. But in 1956, Portland, Oregon, or even before that, was still segregated. So it was sort of a mixed social program. So that's how a lot of tribal people, not from Oregon, Washington, et cetera, moved. And so that's part of the history. It's another way of separating tribal people. So it's harder to maintain your culture, your language, your traditions, your government, et cetera, when you've all been dispersed like refugees. So I think the refugee community has a lot in common with the American Indians' history. Okay, next. Wait, before I do this, I'm going to go back over to, I'm going to show a little bit of Oregon, if you don't mind. So since y'all are in Oregon, this is from the Oregon History Project. This is a map of Oregon Indian lands in 1841. You can see the Columbia River and the mountains. So these were the tribal lands in 1841. They knew that we lost a lot of people to disease post-contact. But by 1855, they think there was 25 to 30,000 immigrants, colonizers, new people to Oregon. And land was promised, right? So they came out there for very cheap land. You should know that when Indian land was taken from people in the beginning, even through treaties, sometimes it was valued around the same price as a sack of flour. So you can see in the old charts about what the value of things were, that was the amount that was often exchanged. This is the reservations that were in place in 1864. And then later on, Congress was like, we need all that land. So they sold it again after the Dawes Act. And so if you look at what happened to the coastal tribes reservation land, it really dwindled down to where Grand Ronde and Sluts are now. And this was a previous reservation, this space called the Malheur area. And in, I believe it says 1887, I forget, but white ranchers wanted that land. So Congress agreed and just wiped it out and said it wasn't tribal land anymore. So that wasn't done with consent, it just was. And of course, at this point, tribal people just had to relocate. So that's a little more of where we get. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint really quick. Whoops. Yeah, no, this one. Okay, so this is in the 70s, early 60s to 70s, they found that 35% of children were still being placed out of home, and most of them through something called an adoption project. So well-intended people thought that they would just offer up their home to little Indian children and give them a better chance and help them be more white and be more successful. A lot of people, as you might have read in the book, were lost to this project. There was not a lot of records. And I like to think about the people who took part in it. I don't believe they were evildoers. I think they were what's called benevolent. Like they did it with a good heart. They just did not know the impact that it would happen. And I think, of course, I don't think they understood deeply the context of which where they sat in the timeline of history and Indigenous people. We also didn't know a lot yet about, well, we did and we didn't, about childhood trauma and multidisciplinary trauma. I always say, I think all of us probably knew or know people who you knew just had a really bad childhood. And when they grow up, you have a little more compassion for them because people say things like, oh, she had it really hard. So if you know that about a person, we have a little more compassion. But when it's a whole group of people, and you don't have like close-up contact, we sometimes forget that. And so tribal people were subject to cultural genocide and assimilation pretty quickly and devastated. And the amount of trauma when you don't even speak the language and are not comfortable being in your own skin, and the internalized hatred that we were given about ourselves, our bodies, our languages is really a painful thing to overcome. And it, I don't think I can understand. There's books and books written on this. And today, in Oregon, the national rate for children in foster care is at the high rate is 12.5% of 1,000 children. No, for Native kids, but in Oregon, 28. So 12 Indians per 1,000 Indian children are in care, but in Oregon, it's 28.8. That's called disproportionality. And we have tons of theories as to why that is. But fundamentally, some of it is multi-generational trauma and people are hurting and never healed and have a lot of problems parenting. But it also relates in the continuing idea that we know better than tribal people as to how to raise children. And we have different ideas about what a healthy home looks like and what we should be expecting for people. This continues to be, this is when we place them with non-natives. So we'll get to that in a minute. So when a child has to be removed, right? So their parents are abusing drugs and are not safe. Children need to be relocated until their parents can be made safe. Most children in other races get placed with their relatives, but Native children still have a significantly higher rate of being placed in white homes. And I worked in a tribal community for 10 years, and I would watch the just natural occurrence that, of course, there's not going to be any family. And I became kind of conditioned to that thought too. It's amazing how quickly a culture can consume you. So this continues to be a problem. It continues to be a problem in how we approve families and license families and what we expect of families to be able to do. I'm going to go to the Q&A real quick. So the question is, can it due to a lack of resources in Oregon on the reservations? I don't know, because I do child welfare for a living and I have for a long time. I do not know the answer of healing genocide. But I do know that the best healing that I've ever seen happen comes within the context of family and being together and being able to just simply be together and break cycles. So my family, my Native side of the family is plagued with all the issues you get with multi-generational trauma. And I see in my own generation and I can track it right through our family. Like I wasn't removed. I was raised within my family, right? And I think that's a key piece. And in child welfare, we're always looking at like, should they have drug rehab? Should they have, and honestly, there's no secret sauce. The only secret sauce I've been able to see is let families heal together. So it's this concept of, should a hurt parent, so I guess I should have mentioned this just a little bit. We never lived in nuclear homes. Most of the world prior to technology did not live in nuclear homes. We always lived in multi-generational clans, even in Europe. But at some point, Europe moves towards nuclear homes, and when contact happens, nuclear homes is the way forward, right? So it's mom, dad, and kids, and the farm, and multiple kids, and that's the way you do it. So as I see today's world in 2022, that system isn't doing very well for children at large, especially when mom's working and we're trying to adjust and we have two parents out of home or whatever. We need each other. Like, one person cannot raise children alone, and neither can two, in my opinion. So when we watch families heal, they typically all need to heal together versus just one, right? So when you have somebody who's a drug user, say, early 20s, and they have children, we always send them away to go get better and come back. And it doesn't work. So it is also lack of resources and poverty. It is a ton of other issues, but the first one, the one that's really hard to deal with, is keeping families together. Child rearing for us was never about individual rights. And so in the Western system, United States, child welfare is explicitly rooted in the rights of the parent. There's no grandparent rights in the United States, and there's fundamentally no children's rights in the Constitution. We're one of the only countries that hasn't signed on to the UN Declaration of Children's Rights. We're really abysmal towards our attitudes towards children. We're still saviors, and we still think the best thing to do for children is to reassign them. And I don't mean any of us on this call, I mean us as a society. Tribal people always thought the child belonged to everyone. So you could not separate a child from their siblings, their grandparents, their aunties, or the land, or their role. So they were not extractable. And that's not the way we've adapted in American society. Tribal people, because we always had to live together in harmony, because your family are traders and we're not going anywhere, we're more like small town, you had to heal that. You couldn't be punished, or you could, but it just wouldn't be a very good long-term solution. One of the things I love about Indigenous culture is that we don't separate our children from things. So in a tribal community, if you go to a tribal community today and go watch, the offices or whatever, kids are around. Kids are always present. Like we didn't have separation. So I remember in Latin communities and other parts of the world too, you'll see people think it's weird that children have their own little room, right? Like we were always communal spaces, and there wasn't this clear boundary. Another difference for tribal people is that children are typically allowed to be children when they're young. So they're given a long leash to have joy, have adventure, have play until it's time to go to work. And that really got lost in the boarding school experience. We really, really learned a lot of punitive ways about raising children, like discipline, like putting a child in the corner, like an actual corporal punishment were not tribal ways. Tribal people believe that children are sacred and can't do anything wrong yet. And it's funny that science is really learning a lot from that. And it's actually kind of coming back around to recognizing that like wearing a child like in a pack or on your body is actually really good for a child's brain. And not, and so things that tribal people have always done that we were shamed for are scientifically shown to be better for babies and young children. And the other piece clearly is that it was never just parents that should be responsible. So if you look at birthing systems for Indigenous people, the village would surround mom, and mom was safe and not overwhelmed and not exhausted. She was assisted so her body could heal. She could make productive milk, and she could bond with baby, but other people were bonding with baby too. And I just think what a beautiful thing. I wish that was available for people everywhere. And I wish it was still available for tribal people. So going to go to my ICWA slides really quick. So I'm going to briefly tell you what ICWA is. Where are we at on time? Okay. It started about 1969, I believe. These grandmothers from some of the tribes went all the way to Congress, primarily from the Lakota and Dakota tribes, and they said, stop taking our children because of child welfare issues. So it wasn't until the 60s that you could call, late 60s, that you could call something called CPS, There was not those kind of hotlines. People did not have a way to report on bad parenting. When you don't have CPS and you can't call the police, who handles children at risk? Their family. And so neighbors and family were taking care of children that needed it. Children were staying with relatives or extended kin or neighbors that were taking care of them. And it wasn't perfect, but that's the way it was before you could call the government and the government would come in and take them. So tribal people were removed at amazing rates. And these women, and like I said, this is in 1978. So we're post the Civil War rights era. And there's a fascinating story as to how this law got passed. It actually kind of became a fluke. It was one of these laws that got snuck in under the end. Not very many people showed up to debate it. It kind of just went through. But anyways, it basically says when you have a tribal child who comes into child welfare and the state did it, you have to do a couple of things for sure. You have to try to always place them with their families. And that can mean non-native families, but just somebody that the child already knows. If you can't find any family, put them with somebody else in their tribe. You have to try to make sure that there wasn't any other solution. We call that active efforts. So there was no other option but to fully remove the child from their family. And that the tribe has a right to show up. So in court and be heard and talk about it. An example is, so I was raised in Portland, Oregon. So if something had happened and I'd come into CPS history, my tribes could have shown up and offered services and gave explanation, maybe provided family members, etc. So it gives the tribe a role because we lost all of our lands for the most part, and people had to move. So this law recognized that the tribe still had a right to our kids. It wasn't on our lands and in our dirt, so allowed them to become a party, like an extended family member. Very similar to if you became subject to something in international space, the United States could show up for you, like if you were arrested abroad. I say you as if you're all Americans. I'm just saying in general, sorry. I usually talk to lawyers about this, so I can get very lawyerly, and I don't want to. Because this is the root of it. And so who's an Indian, right? It's only for people who still have a tribal connection to enrollment. So you have to be a member or able to be a member of a tribe. Can get really complicated because of 1,000 reasons why blood quantum has dropped. And it isn't for every person who says that I think I'm Indian or I'm from an indigenous. It only applies to tribes in the United States. So if you belong to a tribe in Mexico or Honduras, if these do not apply to you, or even in a Canadian tribe. And that's because the United States government only has a special relationship with the tribes within their borders. Also doesn't apply to people of Hawaii or Puerto Rico. So it does what it can. It can be highly successful, but people still resist it. Okay. That's the end of my stuff. So I'm ready for questions. I'm going to answer Anne's really quickly. Sorry, I'm going to drink a little water. Okay. She said she heard that in Canada, children are kept at home, and if an adult is having difficulties, and a foster parent can be brought in until the adult can come back instead of taking children away from their home. Maybe I do know that this is an option when you have, I've never seen it be a stranger foster parent, but I've seen it be an extended family member. So if the parent or one of the parents is having special issues, they'll just, so the agency has to work with the family to find any other solution that they can work on to not remove the family. And why does that work, right? So if you think about that fundamental piece is because the mom shouldn't have been alone anyway. She probably needed help, even if she wasn't using drugs or, and so it really reinstates the traditional kind of family concept to bring them all together. So we find it be really successful, but guess what? Most people can't afford to just not work and go live with another family now. So one of the areas that's significantly lacking in the United States is how we support childcare. what we call kinship subsidies, like helping people who are raising children that are not in foster care, but they're just not theirs, and grandparents. The amount of children being raised by grandparents in the United States is off the charts, and we do not have enough supports for them to do that. I'm reading the next question. Oh, so in Canada, yes, a lot of tribes or First Nations are trying to assume tribal welfare for themselves. So in the United States, I used to work for a tribe in Arizona for 10 years that does manage their own child welfare. In some ways, it's very effective because you know the families, you know the whole context, and you're not removing them because of racial bias or. But the same issues is we still struggle sometimes to understand how to really heal it, and a lot of tribal people, even people like me or who are professionals, have been really ingrained with white values, and so we've learned to not appreciate the way our traditions. And so we're reconciling a lot of stuff. And that particularly comes into play when you start talking about Christianity and Christian values and how that can be really alienating to some families who never subscribed to that. But it is definitely better, but it's not funded. It is terribly underfunded. And then the federal government if it wants to be funded, they want us to have Western degrees in social sciences or law. And that's got a lot of problems. So there's an amazing school in Canada at the University of Victoria that's working on this. And I'm hoping to take some classes there soon that are really finding ways to help tribal people create governmental systems. If I ruled the world and can decide everything, and I know this sounds really overwhelming, families solve problems for children. But for a very small number that we see in the news every single day of children who get murdered and treated terribly, 90+% of children that are in foster care in the United States, over 420,000 children tonight, right now, in foster care, over 90+% of them were removed for neglect. And most of those children, if we never interfered with them, would probably do better than if we had even removed them at all. And that sucks because that means we're helpless. And I don't mean to be completely pessimistic, but the systems we keep trying and trying and trying are not effective, particularly my area of focus for tribal children. The books that we read highlight explicitly not only what it feels like to grow up alone and away from your people, but also the loss of identity.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Sheri, can you stop sharing your screen? I've got a couple of
questions. Yeah. You don't want to read that statute? It's really cool.
It's an important one for sure. So I am curious, this was, I did a lot of learning reading these two books and visiting with Native partners as we planned Novel Idea 2022. And blood quantum was a new concept for me and something that I've been really thinking about. Blood quantum versus just one drop and how those two things work in opposition. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about blood quantum and just one drop. And absolutely, those two concepts are important.
There are over 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States that all get to determine their own membership and their rules for citizenship, just like every country in the world, right? So nations get to decide who their citizens are. However, on some of the tribal nations, the federal government imposed upon them oversight as to the approval. So there was a practice and a history where they started saying you had to have lineal proof. And the government had a really firm interest in tracking blood quantum because you could only be so much Indian when it was okay to own land. And so they really wanted to know blood quantum. It's not a science, like I say, if I were in person, I would say, so I am, I could tell you my fraction and I'll stand up, right? Is it the lower half of me, the top half of me, or am I like an Arnold Palmer, like, am I all mixed up? I don't know. And it's ridiculous, right? So Native people always say, like, I'm not a dog. I don't want to have to prove my paper, like, right? So I view it more like, and so some tribes do descendancy, and they say, if your ancestors were Cherokee, you're Cherokee forever. You can't undo that. Some tribes have moved to residency, trying to bring people back to the community. And then some tribes say you can only be a member of one. Almost all tribes say that, which doesn't make sense because so many of us are members of, or, culturally affiliated with more than one, and then you have to choose. So the bureaucracy of the Western ways of belonging have really created this like spider web of mess. And the intent was to dilute us so that we didn't exist. And the impact is that it's been very effective.
Yeah, it was such a new concept to me. I had no idea. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about it. So great answer. So I'm wondering, or great information. I'm wondering if you're aware of Senate Bill 13 that was passed in 2017 in Oregon about the tribal history shared history curriculum that is now going to be taught in Oregon schools. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about teaching tribal history, shared history in our schools.
So every year when my kids go to school, I have a 4th grader, 7th grader. I always make sure their teachers know. Please let me know if you're going to be teaching Indigenous history, tribal engagement, or Thanksgiving, please. Because my kids have a different experience. And it is critically important that everybody knows the truth, because for one thing, tribal kids deserve to know the truth, but also non-tribal kids, because if you don't tell them and then they find out, they're mad, right? I imagine some of you are mad as you find out, like, wait, I didn't understand that, right? And so it's really important. It's very close, though, to, I don't want to get into a big conversation about what CRT is, but critical race theory is a legal theory. It's a theory. It's not really like history. History supports parts of it, but actual history is important. And I'm impressed Colorado's moved forward, but it comes with political acceptance. So in some states, they'll recognize it and then they'll pull it back. And then it also leaves children open to abuse because they just get mocked. My 4th grader came home yesterday upset that she's learning about the first government of Colorado. And she's like, I wish they would stop saying that. And she's like, there were always governments here because the tribes were here. And I'm like, yes, thank you. Good point. But the key phrase that you want to call out and just mention is like, that's the first time the state made a government on top of people who are already here or whatever. But don't forget that there were people here. So it's like, it shouldn't be on the tribal kids to push the truth. And it makes friends. So I'm glad it happens. I think a lot of people need training on how to deliver it, because kids are going to learn and their parents are going to disagree and they're going to think it's political, and it's just context.
Right. Okay. So we have a couple of questions and comments. Let's see. Let me get to this question from Anne. She wants to know, are folks who are able to stay on a reservation, are they doing better than folks who had to relocate to cities in terms of keeping families together? So
proximity to one another is really important, right? So if you're close to your family, you're more likely to have connection. 70% of all tribal people do not live on tribal lands. Well, on reservations. We all live on tribal land. So here's the question. Who are the most racially and ethnically segregated group in the United States? What race of people is the most segregated? Right? White people. White people are most likely to only live around other white people than all other races. All other races tend to blend together. White people are still the primary group that lives apart. And the reason why that comes into play is because when we find foster families, they typically live over there in the white area, and the children are removed from the communities in which they were seen, right? And then they felt not othered. And so that's a challenge when you're recruiting foster families.
Yeah.
So it's there's not enough housing on tribal communities based on a lot of government action that prohibits building. I don't have answers, but I don't live on my tribal communities. It's hard, and it's internal conflict for most tribal people.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I just have one last question. Is the Indian Child Welfare Act under any kind of threat now?
We could talk a whole nother hour about this. So yes, it is. And it is going to the Supreme Court in October. And the challenge is brought by a white ran institute called the Goldwater Institute, who says that they think it treats tribal children worse because it says that we shouldn't put any barriers to let white people adopt Native kids. And the organization that's behind it, called the Goldwater Institute, they don't care about Indian children. They have a limit. Their express purpose is to take down federalism, meaning they don't want any federal laws. Everything should be state law. And because ICWA is a federal law, they want to take it down. They have no interest in tribal people. They just want to, if they win this one, they view it as low-hanging fruit. It lets them tick-tock into other areas, basically congressional power. And so there's tons of writings about it right now, but I recommend a podcast called This Land Season 2. Mm-hmm. The journalist just got nominated for the Peabody for that. Her name's Rebecca Nagel. Amazing podcast, really fascinating stuff. Yeah. So yes. And so the Indian Child Welfare Act is a tiny tool to just help tribal people be together. Like, we just want to keep our kids together. Yes, we have problems. Yes, we want to heal, but we don't want to be forced to be into white homes. Being white is not the only way. And I know that sounds dismissive, but when you look at the things that make what has always been said is what's better, it comes from Christianity, or what we call Western values. And so thanks for that. So, it's hard, and it doesn't mean I don't love white people. It doesn't mean I'm I do. And I love all the people that bring children into their home, but we have a right to be here and to still be who we are. And so most Native people are in a spirit of reconnecting, right? And reclaiming. And I'm like, they didn't even want us to still live here. And so I'm still standing, right? And I'm going to work on my language. I commit to knowing the history. And I'm not trying to, take everything back, but I will continue to fight to let tribal people keep our children as long as they safely can.
Yeah. I've been really inspired. There are a couple local groups in Central Oregon that are really working on re-indigenizing themselves and learning about Native foods and their cultural ways. And it's been really interesting and lovely to watch.
I would just thank you for that. Culture lives in language, values, and ways of being. The stuff that we can see, our food, our dance, our dress, our jewelry, are our cultural aspects, but they're the top of the iceberg. Culture lives in the way we feel about each other, the way we touch each other, the way what we value and what we don't value. And so we might have to speak English, and we might not know, we might not have buffalo anymore, but we might not have salmon, right? But we know how to touch each other. We know how to show up for each other. We know how to be aunties, even when we're flawed. And so we still have that right.
Yeah, Sheri, this has been really a fantastic conversation. And I I feel like I could talk to you for a long time.
Yeah, probably. I talk about it all the time. So
yeah, I imagine. So I would like to invite everybody who is on the call tonight, or everybody who's going to watch this recording later. There's still a lot of stuff happening around Novel Idea that we would love to invite you to engage with. Our Novel Idea webpage on the library's, Deschutes Public Library's webpage, gives you a lot of information on how you can support local Native efforts to heal and re-indigenize. So please avail yourselves of those resources. And just a reminder that both Christine Day and Diane Wilson will be in Central Oregon on May 6th and 7th. And we are so delighted that they will be joining us in person. And Sheri, any last closing thoughts?
I want to just say, this Seed Keeper by Diane Wilson is maybe one of the best books I've ever read. And it's so clear how much time she spent on it. Like this is a well-researched novel, and it's just beautiful. And like, I can't say enough. And I love my Native women authors, right? And finally, I just want to say thanks everybody for taking this time. And in Ojibwe, it's Miigwech, and Umanha Wibala. So thank you for coming. And so thanks.
Thank you everybody for coming. Thanks. Thank you, Sheri. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.